Good morning, everyone. I'm John OLoughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives. And this morning I'm reading from How the Nation Was Won, America's Untold Story, Volume 1, 1630 to 1754 by H. Graham Lowry, and published by Executive Intelligence Review. So that is a connection to our guest last night, Richard A. Black, who is also a longtime editor and member of the Schiller Institute, actually their United Nations representative. So a diplomatic officer of the Schiller Institute for many decades now, a fascinating opportunity to talk to someone with such a unique perspective. And it is a unique perspective from my history. I have not heard such positive reviews of the Chinese government and the economy over there before, and I think it's fascinating. And maybe some people find it irritating, but it's all good in my book, and we'll find out the best we can what the truth is. A country as large and important as China should not be just relegated to the opinions expressed in mainstream news, in my opinion. So I think it's a fascinating conversation with Richard A. Black last night, and I thank Marcia Maluk and the others who helped arrange that conversation. Well, had a trip to Norfolk yesterday, got up early, went down there, spent a couple of hours in the MacArthur Museum, which is a remarkable place. I never knew about it until about a month ago when I saw a video on YouTube made by the MacArthur Museum about the USS Nashville's relationship to General MacArthur. And so I immediately got in touch with them and their archivist, James Zobel, down there in Norfolk, gave us a great tour of the museum, of the back in the library. We were able to pull out from the stacks all of the things that have been curated there. And I was very happy to find out that he and they had never seen the photographs that I brought down there. These are photographs that my father had from the voyage of the Nashville in 1943, 44, and 45. And so he's very excited to use their professional scanning equipment down there, and he has the photos now, and we'll be coordinating them with events on the ship. I also had the privilege of copying a great deal of material from him, from the archive, and I need to have some time to put that together for you. But I look forward to sharing with you the fruits of our trip down to Norfolk yesterday and back in time to do the interview with Richard Black. So this has been a very busy week here at McDuff Lives, and I've had five, well, if you count two on Thursday, that's six live interviews in the week. And I feel great about it. So thanks guys for helping me keep the show going and for supporting George Webb and his work, which the best thing to do right now is to buy a copy of McDuff Lives. I mean, of Let's Call Him McDuff. Let's Call Him McDuff on Amazon by George Webb. I'm thrilled with that book that George wrote. I didn't write the book. I didn't even supervise it. I didn't edit it. I didn't do anything except for gave him, a lot of my personal stories and photographs. And he put it together in a marvelous way. So once again, thank you, George. Thank you very much for your work to recognize my father's life and career. And as we learn more, it's even more and more exciting the more we study. Pardon me a second. Okay, so now we're starting chapter 6 of How the Nation Was Won, page 183. The caption of this chapter is A Bloody Time of Peace. The period of Queen Anne's reign, following her dismissal of Marlborough's son-in-law in 1710, lasted barely more than 4 years. It was never a period of political tranquility. Marlborough and his Venetian party allies worked constantly to undo her, especially from 1710 on, against the perceived growth of Swift and Leibniz's Republican influence. The oligarchy resorted to increasingly and literally murderous measures. The battle had tremendous significance for America and forced the final determination that its aspirations must never be left dependent on monarchical favor. After the unsuccessful attempt to assassinate Robert Harley in 1711, he nonetheless proceeded immediately upon his recovery in May to secure passage of the South Sea Bill, designed to break the destructive grip of the Venetian Bank of England over the nation's economy. Endorsed by Leibniz, the plan provided for restructuring the ruinous war debt while providing credit for colonial economic development. By the end of May, Harley was made chief minister as Lord Treasurer and raised to the peerage as Earl of Oxford. He was now in a position to consolidate political control and to proceed toward his other major objective, an end to the war with France. The Duke of Marlborough and his backers were determined to destroy any chance for a peace negotiated on the two countries' mutual long-term interests. For 10 years, Marlborough had instead deliberately fought a war of mutual attrition, confined largely to the fields of Flanders. Now, in 1711, the propagandists for the indispensable Captain General projected a triumphant march on Paris for the following year, after Marlborough's allied army seized the town of Bouchain on September the 12th. The attack had begun in August, while Swift's friend Matthew Prior was in Paris, on private instructions from Queen Anne, negotiating terms of peace. During the siege of Bouchain, Marlborough puffed up his new war-winning pose by sending an official communique to London and a secret one to the Elector George of Hanover, announcing plans to establish winter quarters for the army directly along the borders of France. On September 26th, Queen Anne wrote to the Lord Treasurer Oxford that the, quote, Duke of Marlborough shows plainer than ever by this new project his unwillingness for a peace. But I hope our negotiations will succeed, and then it will not be in his power to prevent it. Was the great general poised for military victory? Even by the fawning account of a recent British biographer, his capture of Bouchain was merely the alternative to outright retreat. The siege is something of a military curiosity, for the French army was as close to Marlborough as he was to the fortress, and the entrenchments he dug to hold off a relieving party were 30 miles long. It was a situation of some delicacy. Marlborough's military breakthrough was pure sham, but Britain's Whig press, so accomplished in the art of political lying, declared without blushing that Queen Anne's peace proposals would give away an Allied triumph. Swift wrote to Stella on October 26, quote, "We have no quiet with the Whigs. They are so violent against a peace, but I'll cool them with a vengeance very soon," unquote. Swift's conduct of the Allies. 4 days later, Swift's draft of, quote, "The Conduct of the Allies" was at the printer. It was a devastating expose of the international oligarchy's conduct of the war as a deliberate effort to grind up the populations and economies of Europe in order to remove all obstacles to a Venetian Dutch financial dictatorship. In great detail, Swift also reviewed the policies and motives of the Venetian financiers of the City of London, as well as the Duke of Marlborough's part in the conspiracy to prolong the war. The pamphlet's publication was delayed until November 27th, again as an anonymous work, for the junto still controlled the courts of law. Near the conclusion of the piece, as printed, Swift hinted that the delay also involved the setting of a trap. The Duke of Marlborough, for one, walked right into it. Faced with a dramatic turn in Queen Anne's government, the Whig junto had begun preparations for a possible coup, to be staged as a patriotic upsurge under the banner of the Duke of Marlborough. The Royal Society was already waving the British flag for the great Sir Isaac Newton against the foreign political intellectual influence of Leibniz. The junto now chose the date of Queen Elizabeth's birthday, November 17th, for mass demonstrations against Queen Anne's pursuit of a peace with France, which she hoped would free both nations from the policy of mutual destruction. On the appointed day, Marlborough landed at Greenwich, accompanied by the Elector George of Hanover's right-hand man, Baron von Bothmer. The Bank of England's Kit Kat Club had spread the word and greased the necessary palms for, quote, "spontaneous," unquote, outpourings of welcome for the returning Captain General, complete with burnings in effigy of the Pope and Lord Oxford, head of the Queen's cabinet. Swift reports that such lavish preparations did not go undetected. Due to the preemptive measures ordered by the Queen, the scheme proved wholly abortive, as Swift put it, but he noted two features of the plan suggesting it had a deeper meaning. One was the role of Marlborough, who had always avoided public demonstrations, even when returning from his triumphs of the past. Quote, "Therefore, so very contrary a proceeding at this juncture made it suspected as if he had a design to have placed himself as at their head." As for the second, if what was confidently asserted to be true, that a report was to have been spread at the same time of the Queen's death, no man can tell what might have been the event. The failure of the November 17th plot left Marlborough rather indecently exposed. His fate was sealed during a private meeting with Queen Anne at Hampton Court on November 23rd, when he refused to support her measures for peace. A parliamentary investigation into his personal profiteering from the massive war expenditures was already underway. The junto had assured him of support by a majority of the House of Lords, and Marlborough, quote, "therefore boldly fell, with his whole weight, into the design of ruining the ministry. He was at the head of all the cabals, and fell into all impotences of anger and violence upon every party debate." When Swift's Conduct of the Allies was finally released on November the 27th, it exploded in the reader's mind with the power of a bomb, as a recent British biographer of Marlborough has put it. The pamphlet was an instant bestseller. 1,000 copies sold in the first 2 days, and Swift was evicted from his lodgings. 3 more editions appeared within 10 days. 7 were printed in London by April 1712, and it was also published in Dublin and Edinburgh. Within weeks of the pamphlet's original release, the publisher was hauled before the Lord Chief Justice, the Whig Thomas Parker. Marlborough's part in prolonging the war was the least crime Swift had exposed as far as the junto was concerned. Far worse was his demonstrating that the junto's objective was not victory over France, but the ruin of Britain and France, as prescribed by the junto's Dutch and Habsburg allies. When France had made peace overtures before, during Godolphin's Venetian ministry, Response from London consistently provoked continuing hostilities. In one such negotiation, Swift noted in Conduct of the Allies, the concessions demanded from France were so extravagant that in all human probability we could not have obtained them by a successful war of 40 years. Marlborough's, quote, passing rivers and taking towns in Flanders may have been attended with many glorious circumstances, but had no other end than to enlarge the territories of the Dutch and to increase the fame and wealth of our general. A 10-year effort to conquer Flanders, which is part of Belgium today, demonstrated no intention to defeat the French militarily. Of the Allied campaign, Swift said, quote, give me leave to suppose the continuance of the war was the thing at heart among those in power, both abroad and at home. What reason could there be for a policy of endless war? Swift asked, quote, we are destroying many thousand lives, exhausting our subsistence, not for our own interest, which would be but common prudence, not for a thing indifferent, which would be sufficient folly, but, perhaps, to our own destruction, which is perfect madness. Unquote. The decade of carnage had been perpetuated by, quote, that set of people who are called the moneyed men, such as had raised vast sums by trading with stocks and funds and lending them upon great interest and premiums, whose perpetual harvest is war, and whose beneficial way of traffic must very much decline by a peace. Doesn't it sound like he's writing about today? And I think one of my favorite scenes in any movie is the end of the movie about the Battle of the Bulge. And it's that great actor playing the German colonel. Is it Robert? I can't remember his name, but he has the blonde hair, the blue eyes, the square jaw, and he's the Nazi colonel. And they just lost the Battle of the Bulge, and the tank is, all the tanks are gone except for his tank, and his sergeant, who is just a normal, common person that wants to go home, says to the colonel, he says, "Well, what will happen now? What will happen now?" And the colonel is driving his tank along, and he says, "The very best thing will happen. The war will go on." And I think that's expressed here, 300 years earlier. Yeah, 200. The decade of carnage has been perpetuated by that set of people who are called the moneyed men. Yeah, same story. It is the folly of too many to mistake the echo of a London coffee house for the voice of the kingdom. The city coffee houses have been for some years filled with people whose fortunes depend upon the Bank of England, East India Company, or some other stock. Every new fund to these is like a new mortgage to a usurer. Swift's expose of how the moneyed men had deliberately bankrupted the nation had a tremendous political impact. A modern British biographer of Queen Anne, though devoting only one paragraph to it, simply describes, quote, the conduct of the Allies as the most powerful pamphlet ever known in Britain. Swift summarized the economic toll of 10 years of war in stark terms. All but 2.5 million pounds of Britain's annual revenues were, quote, mortgaged to pay the interest for what we have already borrowed, unquote. Yet, war expenditures averaged 6 million pounds per year. By 1711, interest payments on this ever-growing debt were, quote, 1 million more than all the funds the Parliament could contrive. And 12 million pounds had to be cut from the government's operating budget. Quote, if the peace were made this winter, we are then to consider what circumstances we shall be in toward paying a debt of about 50 millions, which is a fourth part of the purchase of the whole island if it were to be sold. Swift did not mince words in detailing, quote, a conspiracy on all sides to go on with these measures, which must perpetuate the war. He recounted the continual efforts of the Marlboroughs and the junto to manipulate, strong arm, and blackmail the Queen, adding that, quote, nothing is so apt to break even the bravest spirits as a continual chain of oppressions. One injury is best defended by a second, and this by a third. By these steps, a general during the Queen's pleasure might have grown into a general for life, and a general for life into a king. Swift appealed to his readers to think like citizens and emphasized that he expected to, quote, have little influence on those whose particular ends or designs of any sort lead them to wish the continuance of the war. I mean, the general and our allies abroad, the knot of late favorites at home, the body of such as traffic in stocks. And lastly, that set of factious politicians who were so violently bent, at least upon clipping our Constitution, in church and state. Therefore, I shall not apply myself to any of those, but to all others indifferently, whether Whigs or Tories, whose private interest is best answered by the welfare of their country. Unquote. Pardon me a moment. The day after the conduct of the Allies was published, the Elector George of Hanover provided an efficient demonstration of whose interest he served. His ambassador, Baron von Bothmer, lately at Marlborough's side during the threatened coup against Queen Anne, delivered a memorial containing the Elector's formal protest against the preliminary articles of peace. Then, on December 6th, the day before the opening session of Parliament, the Whig press published Bothmer's memorial to arm their allies against the proposed treaty. The session began with the address by the Queen, who drove the conspirators into a frenzy. Quote, I am glad that I can now tell you that, notwithstanding the arts of those who delight in war, both place and time are appointed for opening the treaty of a general peace. The moneyed men, however, had done their work. The junto carried a resolution in the House of Lords designed to sabotage key points of the preliminary agreements between Britain and France. Oxford's ministry struck back with proceedings in the House of Commons against the Duke for siphoning off enormous sums from the army payroll for his personal enrichment. On December 22nd, the junto's forces managed to adjourn the House before the government's charges could be debated. The maneuver did not stay the Queen's hand, however, in stripping Marlborough of all of his offices and commands. Her letter of dismissal was delivered on December 29th, and with a traitor's rage, Marlborough threw it into the fire. Sabotaging the peace. The removal of Marlborough did not end the conspiracy against the peace which Swift had exposed. The charade was over, however, that peace must await a military victory over France that was just around the proverbial corner. During subsequent stages of negotiations, in fact, the Duke of Ormond, Marlborough's replacement as Captain General, was under orders from the Queen merely to maintain his lines and to avoid inflicting any further damage or casualties upon France. The Whigs naturally denounced this reasonableness as, quote, cowardice. For the Venetian party factioneers on both sides, the game now shifted from managing the war to ruining the peace. especially one which might permit both nations to turn their energies toward renewed economic development. The stakes were enormous. If Venetian policies were to dominate post-war Europe, hopes for an American continental republic would appear dim indeed. Soon the streets of London by night became the stalking grounds of a new breed of terrorist thugs, quote, self-styled Mohawks, who assaulted pedestrians as the punkers of their day. Queen Anne's ministers warned the public that the Whig junto was planning riots to overthrow the government. Bothmer reported to George of Hanover that plans had also been made to kidnap the Queen and assassinate members of her cabinet. Additional security measures were taken, including strengthening the Queen's Guard and moving Lord Oxford, her chief minister, into the royal palace of St. James. Robert Harley, now Lord Oxford, had narrowly survived in a previous assassination attempt. The peace conference at Utrecht opened on January 18, 1712, but the negotiations were soon complicated by a rapid series of deaths among the heirs of France's ruling House of Bourbon. Louis XIV was now 73 years old, and his only legitimate son had died the previous year. 1 week after the talks began, the wife of Louis's grandson, the Duke of Burgundy, and next in line for the throne, was stricken with a burning fever and suffered from violent pains in her head. It was believed she had scarlet fever, which develops as a rampant streptococcal infection through the bloodstream. There were, quote, whispers at the same time of ugly symptoms. She was dead in a week, at the age of 26. He died 4 days later, at the age of 29, reportedly of scarlet fever. From the same sort of infection, his older son, age 8, died barely 2 weeks after his father. In the direct male line of succession to Louis XIV, only Burgundy's infant son, who was also stricken, survived, though in an extremely weakened state. Such wholesale reduction of the French royal heirs aroused considerable suspicion, directed particularly at the Duke d'Orléans, the Venetian party's favorite among the nobility. Should the surviving infant die and thus extinguish the direct line of succession, his older uncle, the Duc de Berry, would become king. The next claimant, the younger uncle, was King Philip of Spain, who 2 months later renounced his rights to the French throne. The title would next fall to the Duc d'Orléans, a grandson of Louis XIII, who had married a daughter of Louis XIV. The Duc d'Orléans was widely accused of having poisoned the Duke and Duchess of Burgundy and their eldest son. People called to mind his taste for chemistry and even magic, his flagrant impiety, his scandalous debauchery. Autopsies were performed on the 3 victims, but the physicians were divided on whether the cause of death was poison. Little more than a year later, there were new grounds for suspicion. On May the 4th, 1714, the Duc de Berry died at the age of 27 of a disease, quote, which presented the same features as the previous case of scarlet fever, unquote. Now only the enfant, the king's ailing great-grandson, stood in the way of Orléans seizing the throne. But another death in the royal line might have stretched suspicions too far, and the risk was not worth it in any case. Louis XIV had been under the spell of his Jesuit confessor, Le Tellier, since 1709, to the point of reluctantly absolving Orléans of suspicion in the deaths of Louis's grandson, granddaughter, and great-grandson in 1713. The king remained in good health until August the 12th, 1715, when, quote, sores broke out on his leg, unquote. Whatever treatment was provided, he was soon dying of gangrene. His Jesuit guardians, quote unquote, now inducted him as a full member of their Venetian-run order. As he weakened, a new codicil to his will was wrung from him on August 25th, appointing the Duc d'Orléans ruler of France as the head of the regency for the Enfants until he became of age. To the surprised French magistrates who received this alteration in the king's will, Louis said, quote, "I have made a testament. They insisted that I should make it. I had to purchase my own repose, but as soon as I am dead, it will be of no account." On August 31st, Louis received the final sacraments. Letellier and his fellow Jesuits hovered about his bedside and heard some unwelcome words from the dying king. Quote, "I call you to witness that I have done nothing therein but what you wanted, and have done all that you wanted. It is you who will answer before God for all that has been done." Unquote. A different reckoning took precedence for the moment. Even before Louis expired, his courtiers flocked to pay homage to the new dispenser of royal favor, the Duc d'Orléans. At the end, quote, "some Jesuits gathered around the corpse and performed the ceremonies for one who had died in their order." Unquote. The negotiations begun at Utrecht in 1712 soon faced a lethal counter-assault within Britain as well. Orders were given in May that the new Captain General of the British Army, the Duke of Ormond, to refrain from further offensive actions against France. The policy was privately communicated to the French government. Britain's Dutch and Habsburg allies determined to continue the conflict nonetheless. Marlborough's junto friends, led by the Bank of England's Lord Halifax, demanded in the House of Lords that the Queen direct Ormond, quote, "to prosecute the war with the utmost vigor." Doesn't that sound like Winston Churchill complaining about the phony war during Neville Chamberlain's ministry? Same, just sounds just like it to me. The Whigs attempted to portray Ormond as a cowardly betrayer of the Allies for attempting to establish a ceasefire during the peace negotiations. A supporter of the government responded that Ormond's courage compared favorably with the conduct of a certain general who had deliberately led his troops to the slaughter so that he could fill his pockets by disposing of the commissions of officers killed in action. The desperate Duke of Marlborough challenged his critic to a duel, but backed down upon an order from Queen Anne. Dutch and Habsburg mercenaries continued military actions aimed at destroying the negotiations at Utrecht, but suffered a crushing defeat in July by French forces under Marshal Villars. By the fall of 1712, Villars had driven them out of their key remaining positions on the chessboard, including Marlborough's last prize, Bouchain. Dutch opposition to the peace now collapsed, and Queen Anne began making arrangements to put post-war relations between Britain and France on a positive footing. As ambassador to France, she named the Duke of Hamilton, brother of the Earl of Orkney and one of the circle at court with whom Jonathan Swift had established some influence, especially through Hamilton's sister-in-law, Lady Elizabeth Orkney. On the eve of Hamilton's departure for Versailles in late November 1712, he was murdered, following a duel by one of Marlborough's thugs, the cashiered general Macartney. The challenger was Lord Mohun, whom the Duke of Marlborough had earlier named as his second in the duel, prevented by Queen Anne. As Swift reported, quote, "The Duke of Hamilton was preparing for his journey when he was challenged to a duel by the Lord Mohun, a person of infamous character. He killed his adversary on the spot, though he himself received a wound and, weakened by the loss of blood as he was leaning in the arms of his second, and was most barbarously stabbed in the breast by Lieutenant General Macartney, who was second to Lord Mohun. He died a few minutes afterward in the field, and the murderer made his escape." So did the Duke of Marlborough, who fled to Holland 9 days later and did not return to Britain until August 1st of 1714, the day the Queen died. While this deadly mode of political realignment continued, the Venetians in all camps, especially among the junto in Britain, repeatedly delayed the concluding of a treaty of peace. In January 1713, in a special appendix to yet another edition of his Conduct of the Allies, Swift lashed out at the quote, unreasonable clamors of an insolent faction for bringing about the present stagnation of affairs. He also identified the motive for their obstruction in declaring that, quote, our happiness will not be put off till they who have ill will at us can find some time and power to prevent it. This Whigarchy, as Swift called them now, had added to the repertoire of political lying the charge that the French negotiators were reneging on the initial agreements. Quote, but the authors of this forgery know very well I do not miscall it, and are conscious to the criminal reasons why it is with so much industry bandied about. France rather enlarges her offers than abates or recedes from them. So happy are we finding our most inveterate and ungenerous enemies within our own bowels. Swift's justifiable outrage, however, also carried a hint of desperation. He concluded this appendix with a violent denunciation of the lies and machinations of the Whigs against peace. Quote, but these artifices are too thin to hold. They are the cobwebs which the faction have spun out of the last dregs of their poison, made to be swept away with the unnecessary animals who contrived them. Their tyranny as it is at an end, and their ruin is very near. I can only advise them to become their fall, like Caesar, quote, and die with decency. Death stalks Queen Anne. During the early months of 1713, Queen Anne's government did succeed in moving the Allies, except the Habsburg Emperor, toward acceptance of the preliminary terms negotiated between Britain and France. Though the Dutch had agreed, the Duke of Marlborough sent a personal emissary in March to persuade them to sign at a later date, to make the treaty, quote, at least have the appearance of a separate peace with France, and oblige their British friends who knew how to return so short a delay to very good account. A Dutch representative told Queen Anne's ambassador at The Hague that the person employed by the Duke of Marlborough was then in conference with the magistrates of Rotterdam, to assure them that if they would hold off a little, they should see an unexpected turn in the British Parliament, that the Duke of Marlborough had a list of the discontented members in both houses who were ready to turn against the court, and to crown all, that his Grace had certain intelligence of the Queen being in so ill a state of health as made it impossible for her to live among above 6 weeks. During this period, rumors of the Queen's impending death were as common as Whig tirades against her policies. She had survived 17 pregnancies, 11 of them ending in miscarriage. Periods of fever or weakness of the limbs were attributed routinely to gout, a disease rare in women. Yet, even during the months preceding her brief fatal illness in July 1714, she remained remarkably active, riding at a fast pace as much as 20 miles a day. On Christmas Eve 1713, she was seized by a violent fever, from which she recovered. Yet soon the junto's rumor mills were again grinding away, this time with the report that she was dead. There was unfeigned joy among the Whigs and a speculative rise in the stock market in anticipation of the renewed war. Pardon me. Hey, Professor. It's good to have you here. Professor Hamamoto's joined us. It's nice to see everybody here. Mobster and Harry Hokanen, interesting comments. Appreciate everyone's comments. Hi, Joni of ARC and um, CF Brightmore and everyone else at the chat. Thanks for being here. I always enjoy when I get a chance to glance over and see what you guys are up to. Yeah, absolutely. That isn't that just one of the most suspicious character uh, things in the world is the history of Queen Anne's 11 miscarriages, 17 pregnancies, and not one child survived her. It's pretty hard to believe that that was, quote, natural, unquote. In response, Swift oversaw the production of another biting satire, quote, a modest inquiry into the reasons of the joy expressed by a certain set of people upon the spreading of a report of Her Majesty's death, unquote. The Peace of Utrecht, proclaimed with popular rejoicing on May 5th, 1713, had intensified the rage among that set of people who were determined to erect a new feudal empire. Oh boy, let's do that. That's exactly what we're doing right now. We're trying to erect a new feudal empire with cartels and corporations and oligarchs. It never ends until we expose it to everyone. And that's why we're here. We need to learn this stuff and we need to get it into popular understanding before it's too late and the war party wins. So, the rage among that set of people who were determined to erect a new feudal empire upon the ruins of Britain and Europe. It was no secret that they wished the Queen dead. Swift retorted, quote, the Almighty Being will not shorten the period of her life one moment for all the impatient curiosity of those people who are daily inquiring, when will she die? So long as they keep off their hands, let them wish as much as they think fit. And indeed, when it shall please God to give her the happy change of an earthly for a heavenly crown, let this be written upon her tomb, quote, that in compassion to the miseries of Europe and the sufferings of her own subject, after a bloody and expensive war which had lasted 20 years, she concluded a peace, and that she might transmit the liberties of her people safe to posterity, she disbanded her army, by which glorious achievement she acquired the hatred of a faction who were fond of war, that they might plunder their fellow subjects at pleasure, and of an army that they might do this with impunity. Unquote. Well, that faction still exists, and they have been getting stronger and stronger as the media and the politicians that we see continue covering up their deeds behind the curtain. But that's what we do here. We are the Totos. We will pull back the curtain and expose the real conspiracies that have been running our lives. So, thanks for being with me this morning. I hope everybody has a great day. It's 10 minutes to noon here in Mystery Island on the East Coast, and a good day to go out and start cleaning up the garden.